for a rather long time still practice those kind of interventions on rather regular basis and get funds from national or local authorities for them. So there is no need to name anybody as this is not the purpose of the webinar. Our challenge is obviously to change this situation to better, which means promoting investment in evidence-based prevention and disinvestment from ineffective and harmful practices. Of course, not overnight, but as a well-thought systematic process supported by authorities, civil society, and also academic community. This webinar could be one of these puzzles in this process. And we are very honored and privileged to have three of the most eminent international speakers with us today. So thanks, Wilson, Diana, and Wadih, to accept our invitation to join us and to speak at our webinar today. We're very happy to have you as speakers, and we're sure the webinar will be a great experience and opportunity to discuss important issues in prevention. And hopefully this webinar will be just a starting point also for our long-term collaboration in the future, because I'm sure we have a lot to share in this exciting and constantly changing field. It is important also to mention that this webinar is part of the project on alcohol policy and advocacy led by Slovenian NCD Alliance and funded by the Active Citizens Fund, which is a joint funding program by Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. Finally, we also want to emphasize that this is with this webinar, we are celebrating World Drug Day, which is on June 26th, this week, and at the same time, 15th anniversary of our Institute youth trip, if I'm allowed to say that, and emphasize this important anniversary as well. Because our institute is also a member of Slovenian NCD Alliance, and we are co-organizers of this event. And the anniversary is actually today. So thank you very much. And I would like to give a floor to first speaker. Dr. Wilson Compton is a Deputy Director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, from US. And Dr. Compton's responsibilities include development, implementation, and management of NIDA's research portfolio to improve prevention and treatment of drug abuse and addiction. Obviously the right person in the right place to open this webinar. So thanks, Wilson, to join us today, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you. I am going to suggest that those that aren't speaking mute their microphones so that we make sure there's less feedback. But feel free to post your questions in the Q&A or chat, and I expect to leave at least several minutes, if not plenty of time, for discussion at the end of this. After all, our purpose today is to focus on how science can inform prevention implementation across all of your different countries and regions. And what I've got for you is a brief outline of some of the science and some of the broad perspectives that have allowed us to rethink how we go from educational approaches to more fundamental approaches that help us get at the underlying factors that predispose people to substance use and substance use disorders. That's, after all, going to be the theme, how science can inform our knowledge of how to best provide prevention services in different regions of each of our countries and the globe internationally. Now, I always like to start out with this initial slide from our director at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Dr. Nora Volkoff, and her colleague, Dr. Herb Schelbert, that reminds us that just like we can use imaging to detect diseases of the heart, we've been able over the last 20 to 30 years to use imaging to look at differences in the brain of people who have substance use disorders. So we illustrate for you on the left, healthy brain with lots of blood flow in the front parts of the brain. You're looking down at the head here. So this is the front part of the brain, this is the back. Lots of blood flow as indicated by the brighter colors. Just like we see that in the brain, a healthy heart has lots of blood flow coming through the muscle of our heart. Well, what about somebody with an addictive disorder? What we see is less blood flow, less glucose metabolism in the front parts of the brain. And that's an important clue about what parts of the brain are involved in the distorted decision-making that we see in persons with substance use disorders. Similarly, in a diseased heart, one that's had heart attacks or myocardial infarction, we see diminished blood flow in certain parts. So this tells us how we've been able to use modern imaging techniques and research protocols to help us elucidate the underlying mechanisms involved in drug abuse and drug addiction, just like we can in other areas of health. Now, one of the questions we often get is, well, if it's a brain disease, that means it's hopeless. That means that the brain is damaged, but nothing could be further from the truth. We know from work by Dr. Volkoff and others, and certainly all the clinicians in the audience understand that people can recover. We see their behavior recover. We also see their brain recover. So when you see, this is looking at the imaging of the dopamine receptors deep in the midbrains of normal controls. These are the everyday persons, and we see bright colors indicating a lot of dopamine receptors. We see diminished dopamine receptors in methamphetamine users, but over time, with abstinence and recovery, we see that their brains begin to return to the a level of dopamine receptors much closer to that of the controls. Now, another way to think about the onset of addiction that research has taught us is that it's not just a matter of our genetic background or our biology, nor is it a matter of the environment, but it's really interactions of both the environment and our innate biology with the onset of drug use that leads to addiction. Now, that's a very simple model, and one way to think about it is that while our innate biology, our genetic background won't change, but we have tremendous variation in environmental factors, whether these are biological factors, the influence of various exposures to toxins, to substances early in childhood or even prenatally, as well as the family and peer environment, neighborhood and community, and laws and culture. All of these different levels of the environment can influence our predisposition to develop substance use and substance use disorders. In particular, it may, in all of these levels, may interact with our innate biology in the onset of these serious health conditions. Now, as if this weren't complicated enough, we need to think about how these environments and how our brains vary across time, across age. So we've known from some very elegant work going back over the last 15 years or so that the brain develops in meaningful and predictable ways across childhood and adolescence. And we'll come back to this in a little more detail. And I know Dr. Fishbein will go over this in quite a bit of detail to help us understand how brain development may underlie some of the risks of the onset of drug use and how prevention can be implemented to be informed by this knowledge. Now, what are these predisposing factors and how important is the environment to our brain development? Well, here's an extraordinary example coming out of the orphanages in Romania a number of years ago, showing that children who were in orphanages who were quite deprived of their social interactions, of touch, of play, and of all those things that help children develop in healthy, full ways, that the amount of time spent in that relative period of deprivation showed much less brain development. We showed less connections in important parts of the brain, depending on how long a youth had spent in that orphanage. So that's a basic principle that social neglect can play a key role in distorting brain development. But the converse is also true, that if we enhance social interactions, if we supplement these with improved parenting and improved interactions, we can actually enhance brain development. Another way to look at this comes from a large-scale epidemiology study that reminds us that early childhood, and this is a theme I want to highlight for you, is that while drug use may express itself during adolescence or adult life, the roots of drug use and drug use disorder start much earlier during early childhood. So here's an example of how early childhood adverse experiences, these are things like abuse and neglect that can happen well before a child even enters school, that the number of these issues, whether that's abuse or neglect, the more of them, the more likely a child is to use substances later in life. So it's a strong indication of the importance of early childhood environment in the onset of drug use and drug use disorders. And we'll come back to this in a little while, because it turns out we can do something about these adverse childhood experiences. We can both minimize the number of children that experience these very negative environments, and even when they have experienced them, we can improve their outcomes by changing the environment to help promote positive growth and development. I just have one other sort of basic background study that I want to highlight for you. And this is a very large scale study coming out of New Zealand. It's Terry Moffat's study of the development of about 1,000 children followed very carefully from early infancy through now their 30s. So it's been a very long-term observational study. What Dr. Moffat and colleagues illustrated in these wonderful graphs is that the level of self-control that can be measured at age 3, 4, and 5 is a strong predictor of many outcomes during adult life. So let's look at the left. We see health problems. These 3 lines indicate health, general physical health index, a substance dependence measure from informants or their own self-report. And what we see is that a 3- and 4-year-old who has high self-control, that means the ability to manage their emotions, resist temptation, wait patiently, and understand long-term outcomes, that those children are much more likely to have low levels of health problems and substance use. You can also see that they are more likely to have positive socioeconomic outcomes. So they're more likely to be have higher socioeconomic status as adults and less likely to have financial struggles. We also know that those who have greater self-control early in childhood are less likely to have criminal behavior, so to be arrested and be incarcerated as adults. The strong implication are that early childhood interventions, that particularly those that may focus on self-control and self-regulation, may bring a return on investment. So that's a key early risk factor that's now been shown in this and other longitudinal studies to be very strongly associated with substance use problems, as well as a whole host of socioeconomic outcomes and social outcomes. Now, my institute, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has published over the last now 15 to 20 years basic publications on the principles for preventing drug use among children and adolescents. And what it reminds us is that the prevention interventions, particularly those that focus on these early risk factors that have a whole host of outcomes, can have long-term effects on drug use and abuse, but they can also have an impact on social emotional functioning across a broad range of outcomes. Now, this seminal publication for children and adolescents was followed up somewhat more recently by a focus on early childhood, because if we know that the roots of addiction can start in infancy and even pretty much at birth, depending on the circumstances and the environment that children are raised in. And so knowing that, what can we do to enhance and maximize the potential of children? That's the basis for these documents that help provide information about how to implement prevention at these different ages. Now, the basic principle here is that intervening early can alter the life course in a positive direction. This is a very important observation, and I think it's well known to everyone that's observed children that what happens early in childhood can help predict and shape what happens to a child later on. So we all know that exposures to certain opportunities can spark interest and curiosity and help set someone on a course in terms of their potential career and professional outcomes. But similarly, this can make a big difference even in more fundamental aspects of health and behavior. Now, I want to give you just a couple of examples of how this has been implemented successfully. There was an observation that there are many high-risk families that have high rates of child abuse and neglect. And researchers and practitioners developed the nurse-family partnership to address this. The initial goal was to reduce child abuse and neglect. But as I pointed out, these early risk factors may relate to later onset of substance use and other health outcomes. So what happens to those children and their families that are exposed to the nurse-family partnership during the first 2 years of life? This long-term study showed that even by age 12, being exposed to the nurse-family partnership, that's the green bars, were much less likely to begin using substances by age 12. They were less likely to have internalizing problems. That's things like depression and anxiety by age 12. They're even doing better in school. So their reading and math scores at age 12 are higher than those in the comparison that didn't have the benefit of this nurse-family partnership intervention. Interestingly, it's not just the child that may benefit from this. The target is the child and the child development. But it turns out by helping mothers, mostly mothers, but families raise healthy children and be more successful in being parents may reduce the stress on the parents themselves. So I was quite intrigued to see that not only are the youth outcomes improved, and this is a replicated finding now from several studies, but in this case, the mothers seem to have less problems with alcohol and drug use later in life. Perhaps that reflects the stress of raising children that are struggling in terms of children that may be using substances, have internalizing problems, or struggling with school. And so when we help children, we may actually be helping the parents as well. Another set of studies I want to highlight for you would be the Seattle Social Development Research Program, which was implemented early in childhood during the initial entry into school. So around ages 5, 6, 7, and 8. So these early school years is when this was implemented in a way that promoted the bonding of children to their schools and to their families and neighborhoods. So what happens if you help children be more linked and socially connected to their schools in a pro-social way? Well, first off, it reduces their early conduct problems. So they're better behaved in school and they have less disruption in terms of their behaviors. By the 5th grade, which would be around 10, 11, or 12, they are less likely to begin initiating alcohol and other substances and less likely to have full-blown delinquency. As early adults, they've been shown to be less likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. And by age 27, they have better mental health and economic and educational attainment. So this reminds us that these early interventions that had really not much follow-up. So it's that early interventions that can set a child on a very positive life course trajectory. And that's based on an understanding of brain development and of human development across these time periods. Now I want to switch gears. I focused initially on this sort of broad concept of the importance of early childhood and how environments can shape our brain development and our social development, and we can modify that with interventions. That's what prevention is all about. But let's shift and focus a little bit about adolescent brain development. I showed you these slides on that showed you a version of these brain development slides that you see over here on the left in that first slide where I showed the brain development across adolescence. Well, one of the things that we've learned from these observations of normal brain development is that the brain develops primarily from the back towards the front. Well, what does that mean? In the middle part of our brain, the deep central parts are our limbic regions. These are the emotional centers of our brain. Those mature before the front parts of our brain. Well, what's in the front parts of our brain? The front parts of our brain are in the prefrontal and frontal regions, are where the control of behavior is fundamentally based, where decision-making and judgment and how we make choices in our environment are mediated through and developed through these frontal parts of our brain. So what does that mean? That means that the emotional, the reward centers develop first, and so adolescents may have an exquisite response to the potential rewarding or distressing aspects of their environment before they develop the ability to put the brakes on, to control their behavior, which is what the front parts of our brain, the prefrontal regions and frontal lobes, broadly speaking, are designed to produce. This may help us understand why adolescence is a particular period of risk for poor judgment and decision-making that produces a whole host of negative problems, but it also explains some of the excitement and opportunity that we see in adolescent development. The increased ability to explore, to try new things without much regard for their long-term consequences. So in some ways, our adolescents are both the risk takers, but they may be those who develop new ideas and new ways of solving problems. So we don't want this to go away. We would just like it not to be focused on drug use, which can hijack these early developing systems differentially. Now, this is reflected in this really remarkable set of data coming from many countries around the globe that show us that the age of first use of substances that cut across a variety of substances, whether that's tobacco, alcohol, or illicit drugs, tend to be during adolescence. So it's rare, not impossible, but rare to have onset of substances before puberty. It's also rare to have the first onset much later than mid-20s. So it's that broad period of adolescent development that is the period of exquisite risk for the onset of these conditions. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, because that period and that early onset may be particularly risky and problematic. We do know that multiple studies now show brain changes from youth who use substances. Here's just one example from use of cannabis. Interestingly, though, while cannabis worsens memory, and this is shown in this study from a few years ago, that those that are using marijuana have worse performance on multiple tests of memory. But if they're abstinent, when they stop using marijuana, their brain abnormalities in terms of the measurable differences in certain parts of their brain improve, and they also have an improve in their memory function. So that's a very important message, that recovery and that abstinence or avoidance of these substances can protect or help the brain recover. Now I'm going to shift and talk about not just marijuana, but nicotine exposure. We've been shocked in the US, and I don't know your situation in your country, so you may have to tell me about it, but we've seen that vaping of nicotine has just exploded in popularity among youth. So we have many, many millions of early teens and late teens who are vaping in the most recent years. Now, why do we care about this? We particularly care because nicotine exposure may be particularly risky for early adolescence. There's now at least 2 and several other studies showing that nicotine exposure during early adolescence in animal models is associated with much greater risk of problematic use of nicotine or other substances later on. And so this early exposure may prime the brain for long-term changes that if the exposure is during to an adult brain, those changes may not take place. Now, a key issue in communicating this and in doing the prevention around vaping has been this subtle distinction. As adults, we understand that e-cigarettes or vaping of nicotine may be safer than smoked tobacco. The problem is that safer, a relative term, is not the same as safe. So this study from our colleagues in Buffalo have shown us that conventional cigarettes have very high levels of multiple different toxic compounds, whether they are the direct cancer-producing compounds or heavy metals. Vaping products, e-cigarettes that may include nicotine, of course, have much lower levels of these harmful products, but they're lower, they're not zero. So even using these vaping products is riskier than breathing air and healthy behavior. It also can lead, as I showed you, early exposure to nicotine during these adolescents may lead to greater risk of addiction to nicotine and other substances. So that's been a conundrum and a difficulty that our prevention field in the US has been dealing with in the last few years, how to prevent tobacco use by addressing nicotine exposure in vaping products. Now, I thought I'd highlight for you a couple of new directions for our prevention research program at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. In particular, I wanted to highlight for you a study that I think is just fascinating, and I look forward to seeing it replicated and developed further. This was a prevention program that did family support and family interventions for early teens in a high-risk group in rural southeast part of the United States. They then followed these youth up over the next now about 10 years, and a number of them had imaging of their brains to look at, well, what happens to brain development in those that get these family-based interventions versus those that don't. Other studies show that these interventions reduce the use of substances and ameliorate other social risk factors and negative behaviors. But what about brain development? What we see is a very important finding that the more years in poverty during the teen, and that goes from 0 to 6 years between ages 11 and 18, that we see a less volume in brain regions in the amygdala, so some of the limbic regions, as well as the hippocampus, that's the CAC2 volume. So less brain volume in these important parts of our brain based on the years in poverty. So one could say that poverty, at least as measured in this study, is toxic to brain development. Well, that alone would be an important finding. But what they also showed is that those youth that got these interventions that help support families and raise healthy children despite those negative environments, that those families, that the children in those families had normal brain size, and there was no impact of poverty in those that got this intervention. So it suggests to me that while we may have a difficult time addressing poverty in a widespread, broad basis, but we might be able to bring these relatively inexpensive and feasible interventions into widespread or universal use to help raise healthy children and allow their brains and their social development to progress. Now, this is just one study, so we need to see it replicated and developed further, but I was very excited to see this and look forward to understanding whether other researchers do find the same changes and differences. We will be testing this and other outcomes in the adolescent brain cognitive development study. I want you to notice the large number of participants. This is a landmark project that includes some 12,000 9-year-olds at baseline, and they're now in the middle of doing the 2-year follow-up. So even at the 2-year follow-up, we're seeing a very high follow-up rate. This is only 55%, but that's because they're in the middle of the study. We fully expect and anticipate that they will get about 90% of the baseline subjects will be followed up at 2 years. We will be doing repeated brain scans on these youth every 2 years for at least the next 7 to 10 years. So this will take them from 9 and 10 to at least 19 or 20 years old with repeated examination of their brain, as well as very careful assessment of their neuropsychiatric development. There's a lot of research coming out of this project, and all the data is available for you and others to examine. So please go to dstudy.org for further information about this landmark study and to learn how you might be able to use the data or your research colleagues at a local university to understand normal and disturbed brain development. I'll just highlight for you a couple other major projects. We have a large-scale program at NIH called Helping End Addiction Long Term. We've launched several large-scale prevention interventions, particularly focusing on late adolescence and early adult life, where we have very few proven effective prevention interventions. And we know this is the period of onset of risk of opioid use and the most serious consequences. So we're looking at ways to interrupt the later trajectory in older adolescents and young adults. We're also launching another large-scale study that, considering that we're interested in this early childhood development, should be another landmark project. This is the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study that will follow newborns. That's right, not 9 and 10-year-olds, but newborns with neuroimaging studies as well as cognitive, behavioral, and social emotional development measures for these newborns, and then following them on a yearly and biannual basis to look at normal and disturbed brain and social development. These are the kind of projects that I think will lead to the next generation of mechanistically informed interventions for prevention. Okay, I'm really done with the main messages I wanted to convey today, but I think it's very important to keep in mind that our environment is not static, but shifts every day based on what happens around us. And of course, all of us have been dealing with the COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. Has this had an impact on addiction? The answer is yes. While the attention has, of course, been on infectious disease, there have been major impacts on addiction and substances during this time. Stress and stigma is a major predictor of relapse or use of substances. Well, I don't know about you, but I've been feeling stressed, and I think everyone has been stressed during this time. We've changed the way people have access to healthcare, and that has limited access to life-saving healthcare when it comes to substance use disorders. One very practical issue is a major risk for overdose death is being alone when you use substances. Well, we're encouraging people to keep social distance, so that may increase the likelihood of death because there's no one there to rescue you if you have an overdose and stop breathing. These are just among some of the challenges that may interact with the addiction phenotype and addiction issues during this current pandemic. Now, what does the data show us? The data show us that there's been an increase in drug use. We've seen particular increases in the synthetic opioids, particularly in the young adults. So the 18 to 24-year-olds have had a marked increase in fentanyl, so the very potent, highly lethal synthetic opioids during the pandemic. We've seen overall increasing overdose deaths during this time period. Early in the pandemic, we saw particular increases in these synthetic opioids. This is fentanyl and related compounds. Now, even within, you think of the US as one country, but I think of it as 50 separate states. And even across our country, we see tremendous variation. So it's an important reminder that drug use is, while drug use is universal and the broad problems are universal, the specific issues that any region, that any community, neighborhood, or region face vary considerably. And our interventions and our approaches need to take that variation into account. We've also certainly seen that the service delivery system has major impacts, some of which may actually turn out to be good. We've seen the development of use of virtual techniques to promote meetings like this one. Well, clinicians are using these to connect with their patients and provide services in a safe, remote way. Well, some of these changes we maybe implement long-term to increase access to care. So a little bit of what we're learning during the pandemic may turn out to be beneficial long-term lessons as well. All right, I'm going to wrap up now. I'm very excited to have brought what I hope will be a useful view of the importance of the early childhood environment in terms of addressing the long-term positive trajectories of youth. That's the goal of prevention, is to promote positive development by supporting healthy children, by creating healthy environments in which they live. And the environments that are most important will be, of course, family, neighborhood, school, but think more broadly in terms of other ways to address these issues in terms of policies and practices. Developmental sciences provide an essential understanding of these and tell us where might there be modifiable risk factors that we can do something about. It's the long-term research that is both a wonderful opportunity, but also a challenge, because we need to understand what happens over the long term, and that means our studies will be very long. Science can offer tests of these solutions, and I look forward to hearing your ideas about how science can be modified to best address the needs of your population and your community. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Wilson, for great speech. There are already questions for you, so it's, I think, the best idea to start with them. Referring to Brody's study from 2017, the question is that how was poverty measured in this study?
Poverty is measured. I encourage you to read the actual paper. Remember, I'm talking about it as a secondary consumer of this data. We supported it, so we're very excited about it, but it's Dr. Brody's study, so I encourage you to read about it. My understanding is that it was primarily based on income and relative income during those time periods. Poverty is usually defined based on local standards. So what's poor, while there are international standards for extreme poverty, poverty is also a relative phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. And the next question is about therapy for children. Does therapy for children from poorer families help to their brain development? And also, is it important to include parents?
Well, the question about therapy means that in some ways you're asking me to be a psychiatrist and think about, does child psychiatry and child interventions make a difference? That's a little beyond the prevention scope and is more focused on treatment. And of course, those can be life-saving for children who are experiencing severe problems. What we're mostly thinking of when it comes to prevention are more in the normal range of behaviors. So promoting children staying within that normal range of behavior and outcomes. The major positive interventions, to my mind, are family-based and typically do include at least a mother, if not both parents, and the entire family constellation. There are other successful interventions that focus on schools and teachers, as particularly for once children are school age, they spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day in school. So that's the other major place where we see the opportunity for broad-based interventions. But family would be the number one approach that looks, to my eye, that looks successful.
And also, if I understand correctly, interventions which involve the whole families are the most effective. Or not?
There are some nuances to this in that many of the interventions may focus on mothers, particularly when I look at like the nurse-family partnership model. An awful lot of those families were single mother families. So it did involve the whole family, but they were a relatively smaller unit. But I certainly would say that that's a basic principle that virtually all therapists are taught and family interventionists, that if you don't think about the entire constellation of actors in that situation, we may be missing something. But the primary intervention may be with just one parent and the youth.
Yeah, I meant this kind of family, not separately children and separately parent or parents. So,
something that's been intriguing to me is that in some of the middle school interventions, so that means interventions for 11, 12, 13-year-olds, they may be family-based. So the families may come to these interventions for a few sessions, and yet we see very widespread, broad effects of these. How can you only reach a quarter of the families and still have a broad impact on the entire population? Well, it turns out that if we intervene with some families, those messages are connected to the social networks of those parents and those youth. Mm-hmm. So that just like intervening with one parent may have an impact on the other parent in the house because they talk to one another. One person's behavior influences the other. We mm-hmm. see that same pattern apparently happening in the social networks of families that participate in these prevention interventions. So remember that there may be a contagion in a good way of the prevention interventions that you engage in with families in your communities.
Great, thank you very much. There is another question. You say that addiction is a brain disease. That could be somewhat understood in the context of substance use, but how do you argue addiction problems like gambling and the internet?
Well, the boundaries between substance use disorders and other addictive-like behaviors are quite blurred. As Dr. Volkov, my director and a colleague, say, we only have one brain. So the same parts that are involved in pathological behavior are involved in normal behaviors and in all sorts of outcomes. So we see overlap in terms of obsessive compulsive disease, which is quite distinct from addiction, but yet we see those repetitive behaviors. Well, that same part of our brain that's responsible for repeating actions in an anxious and uncontrollable way may be important for both addiction and OCD. Now, that doesn't mean that they're the same condition, because they're not, and the treatments are very different and the approaches are different, but there's some same underlying pathways. I would suggest that we see an awful lot of overlap between gambling behavior, and indeed we do see brain abnormalities, the reduced frontal lobe, a relative frontal lobe functioning in persons who are at risk for gambling addiction as other substances, as substance disorders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. There is a question from Nigeria. What is the role of psychosocial support, psychoeducation in this study? I suppose it's the same study.
Well, one of the things to keep in mind is that we've known now for decades in that education alone is not enough to change behavior. I can teach people every day about the importance of exercise, about the importance of not smoking. And while they may understand that, it won't do much to improve their ability to exercise on a regular basis or not engage in negative behaviors. Knowledge alone may set the stage for behavior change, but isn't enough. So that's why we focus on other ways that may get at underlying motivations for substances or the underlying risk factors. Unfortunately, there's a tendency to think that just by teaching people, we can change their behavior. And yet that's been proven over and over to be inadequate as an approach. And I know you're going to hear more about that from my colleagues, Denny and Wadih, over in the next couple of hours.
Yes, I'm sure we will hear about it also in the next two speeches. And the last question in the Q&A is, what can the state government do to motivate parents to pay more attention to these aspects of child development in the early years of their lives? So you're coming from this target group, this policy and decision makers.
Well, I think one of the ways it could be approached is to find ways to finance and support these interventions. There's certainly been a move to implement the nurse-family partnership and related models more widely in the United States. I'd like to see the United States be a better role model in the widespread implementation of these interventions. We're not. We have them in some locations and not others. While you all think of us as one country, we really are 50 separate countries, and each state determines for itself what kind of services and practices they wish to implement. So in some ways, we're closer to a European model where each of your countries needs to make up its mind about how it's going to support these efforts. Mm-hmm. Now, this is, of course, a broader discussion, and I look forward to my colleagues having more to say about how to implement these programs in many countries around the world.
Yeah, I know it's difficult because you probably know the study recently from a few years ago from Lancet about adverse childhood experiences. What is the harm and how much we could benefit if we, I don't know, decrease for 10% adverse childhood experience, we would save in Europe $49 billion, and in US, North America, 56 billion. So it's important to also for policy and decision makers to take this into consideration, because it's not just lives, but it's also a budget issue.
there's some very important economic work. One of the groups that's done this comes out of our Washington state, and the Washington State Policy Group has focused a great deal on the economic benefits and the cost effectiveness of prevention approaches. And one of the interesting arguments that they made for their legislator that I believe was successful was that by investing in prevention, they didn't have to build a prison. So, you know, if you need to incarcerate people, you build a prison, and it takes you years to do that. Well, by investing in prevention, they reduce their need for the same number of prison beds. And to my mind, that's just a fantastic trade-off.
Yeah, but we should not forget also the biggest problem with decision and policymakers' interference is also about the interference from unhealthy industries, which is another important issue in this case.
Well, we're not going to solve all the problems today, and I do think you're reminding us of the complex nature of these conditions with multiple factors that lead into them. But I think we need to not be trapped by the complexity, that we can pull it apart and have impacts sometimes in relatively modest ways, but we're working to improve the size of our impacts over time. That's why we're engaged at NIH, at NIDA, in supporting long-term basic science research, like our ABCD and our healthy brain and child development study, to understand these factors so we can develop better interventions in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Wilson. It was a great speech and also a great discussion. You would like to add something?
I just wanted to say, I've shared my slides with you, Matej, and you are welcome to share them with all the participants.
Yeah, we will.
And if anybody has questions and follow-up, just send me an email and I'll be happy to respond. I really appreciate this chance to share with you quite long distance. I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. right now.
That's the benefit of pandemic, obviously, because it would be much harder to get you here in Slovenia for the seminar.
It's true. This took me an hour or a few hours as opposed to a few days. So
instead of long flight to Ljubljana, yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. And if there will be some other questions for you, we will send you by email and inform attendees also about your answers if necessary.
That'll be terrific.
Okay, great. Our next speaker is Dr. Diana Fishbein. There are a lot of affiliations next to your name, so I will not repeat them all. So you just read them from the webinar materials. But I've been in touch with you mostly in your role as president of National Prevention Science Coalition, which is, I think, the biggest prevention advocacy coalition in the world. And we are very proud to be members. I think the only member outside US in your coalition. So it's really a pleasure, and I'm honored to host you, to have you here in this webinar. And I'm really excited to hear your speech and presentation. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the screen is yours.
How is that? Is that viewable?
Yeah, everything is perfect.
That's good. All right, something works, because not everything does in this virtual world. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. And I want to thank Wilson for that amazing presentation that just hit so many areas of the substance use research spectrum that I think it gave a really broad understanding of the exciting things that are happening in the field. So I'm going to dig into healthy adolescent brain development and how this information, this body of research has so much import for, prevention science, for what we can do to prevent early. And when I talk about prevention, I'm really, in this regard, I'm really talking about prior to use, prior to that first use, okay, that we really want to focus on the pathways so that we can identify points during the pathways throughout childhood and adolescence where we can intervene early, or even preferably not just intervene, but actually change the environment so it's nurturing and so that children can thrive and have healthy development and we don't have anything to prevent. That's ultimately the goal here. So I just want to start by saying that when I was in school, and that was a really, really long time ago, we were kind of drawn away from studying adolescence because you're doing lab work and looking at biology and how that relates to behavioral disorders. And adolescents are so mercurial, and there's so much going on. There's so much change during this period of time, and so much variability in the outcomes of that change that it's too hard to control. So we were, my mentors kind of veered me away towards adolescent development because it was just unmanageable from a research perspective. But my gosh, that is so wrong. And the field has self-corrected. So we no longer feel that way at all and haven't for decades. In fact, adolescence is one of the most exciting periods of time with respect to opportunities to really ensure successful outcomes for our young people. So I'm going to start by saying, what do we know after 40 years of research? And I'll also point out that, I think it's fortunate. I think it's a good thing that Wilson and I are going to overlap a little bit, but we're going to come at it. I'm going to get into more depth about some things that he didn't. He got into more depth about things that I won't. But you'll hear some similar themes, and I think that's all good. So I want to start by saying what we do know, because there's a lot we still don't, but lots of needs for research. We all have jobs for a long time, but we all know that all high-risk behaviors involve poor self-regulation. And you will see poor self-regulation threaded throughout all of my slides. Wilson refers to it as self-control. Same thing, okay? So we can put that aside. But they all involve poor self-regulation, and they are preventable if appropriately addressed. So that's one thing that we know. The other thing that we know is that adversity, stress, and trauma are often root causes and can come from a number of different sources within the home, within the community, or with even throughout society. So there are a number of different kinds of adversities. So we'll be talking about that. Both the risk factors themselves, for example, in the prevailing environment, and their negative impacts, for example, resulting in dysregulation of emotion and of behavior, are preventable, again, if appropriately addressed. Evidence-based programs have been developed for the prenatal period through adolescence and emerging adulthood. And when I say evidence-based programs, I mean they have been vetted. I was going to talk about thresholding for what is evidence-based and what isn't, but I decided, if you want to ask questions about that, great, or I can respond to questions even after the fact. But I decided not to go into that because it's another presentation, as Matej well knows, because he's very in-depthly involved with that. But there are in-depth, well-vetted, well-tested programs shown to be effective for the prenatal period across the lifespan in reducing substance use disorders. And the next speaker is going to talk about that in a lot more detail, so I'm just going to skim that part. Programs work best when mapped. This is a very important principle. When mapped to underlying mechanisms of the phenomena we wish to prevent. So when we design programs that don't hit those underlying generators, for example, programs that focus on the substance use behavior without looking at what underlies it, without attending to the biology and the stress and the family situation, the parenting and individual level characteristics, we miss the boat. So the point here is, let's not wait till we have substance use, and let's not focus on just the substance use itself. Let's look at what's leading to that. And finally, we also know that these kinds of programs are particularly going to be effective for children who are marginalized, who are disenfranchised, who are in poverty, who are exposed to a lot of adversity. These programs are likely to be really effective for these children and adolescents. Okay, so what developmental neuroscience is what we're talking about here, because we're talking about adolescent brain development. So first I'll talk about what the relevance is for the field of prevention science. So just coming from from really a research perspective. And I love this picture because it kind of says it all. But recent trends in prevention science are driven by the mounting body of research on the brain. And so what we're starting to understand in prevention science is that if we can move the needle on some of these neural substrates that are being impacted by the environment and other social conditions and parenting and family situations and poverty and so forth, if we can move the needle in the brain, the underlying generator, then we're going to end up potentially with behavioral improvement. And that's what we're all shooting for. First thing, the brain is plastic. The brain is plastic, meaning it's malleable, it can be changed. Certain things we can't change, but there's a lot that we can change and improve, and I'll talk about in a few minutes. It's plastic for the better and for the worse. I'll start with the worst part of the equation, which is that we know that we've established very well that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, Wilson mentioned, affect the brain and behavioral health and well-being. We have established that, and Wilson showed some really compelling slides to document that. But for the better, and this relates to intervention potential, for the better, this research shows that it's plastic to the extent that we understand now what some of the neural systems are, what these circuitries are that support healthy attachment, socialization, adaptive learning, and once again, self-regulation of behavior and emotion. We're beginning to really understand what these neural systems are and how they work to support social behavior. And it also emphasizes the importance of nurturing caregivers and environments on brain development, hence this picture. Now, with respect to developmental neuroscience, with regard to prevention practices, okay? So what does the research tell us in terms of how we practice prevention? It has tremendous potential to bring a lot of different sciences together from a number of different disciplines to develop a more integrative, holistic model of how interventions can work. And I love the question about policy that was asked earlier, and love to talk about that later because I'm very involved with policy initiatives. But let's understand everything more comprehensively, more holistically, because then we can really target the environment, we can target the individual, the whole complement of factors that come together to influence individual behavior. And this information has had the neuroscience, right? The brain development has enormous implications for the prevention of behavioral problems and for how do we promote wellness? How do we promote learning? How do we promote getting through adolescence successfully without developing a substance use disorder? This information also guides information of targeted programs. So in other words, the targeted programs that actually map to the underlying generators in the brain and in our social context that undergird, that scaffold self-regulation. Targeted programs work best when they do map to those underlying generators. And it has demonstrated that if they're well-timed from a developmental perspective, these evidence-based strategies have potential to actually enhance the way the brain develops and potentially have an enduring impact at very important points in the developmental trajectory. Okay, and then in a little bit, Wadih will be talking more about this as well. So it's very exciting time for prevention. So exploiting brain plasticity for preventative purposes. I love showing this because it brings a little reality to the situation. So these are adults and these are aggregated brains. This isn't just one person's brain, they're aggregated. And what we see in adults that have a spider phobia, on the left, when they are shown pictures in the scanner of a spider, they freak out. That these subjects, they're phobic, and we see significant activation of a part of the brain that's responsible for fear. The parahippocampal gyrus, responsible for fear and high emotional arousal. After cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a psychosocial type of therapy that is used commonly as sort of a base in substance use therapies. After this, after a few weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy, shown spiders again, this phobic response has been completely extinguished. Okay, let me go to the next one. Another example. So here we have the amygdala lighting up on the left quite a lot when normal subjects receive emotional content in the scanner. So they're shown, really emotional pictures. Some of them are pretty horrible. And you see the amygdala light up. The amygdala is very much associated with negative emotions. After learning meditation, these same subjects, again, these are aggregated brains, these same subjects, after 8 weeks of training in mindful attention meditation, we see less activity looking at the same kinds of emotional pictures. So this is pretty amazing that after only weeks of these kinds of interventions, we can see change in the brain in adults where their brains are, more or less fully formed. Can you imagine the extent to which the child and the adolescent brains can change if presented with really solid interventions that are very well mapped? So this, I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but I just want to say this is the model that I'm going to use in this talk. And on the very right, I'm going to kind of go backwards. So on the right, we see the liability risk threshold. So this varies. We're not always at the same threshold for substance misuse. We vary throughout development with respect to how high or low we are on this threshold. And to a great extent, where we land on this threshold depends on our behavior. Hopefully you can see my cursor. So it depends on behavior, the extent to which we can self-regulate, our mood stability, the extent to which we're novelty seeking, that we can inhibit our impulses. Aggression is a major factor, risk factor, cognitive control over emotion, and attention. All of these things are sort of, we call intermediate phenotypes, determining ultimately our placement on this liability threshold and changes. At what undergirds, what supports these behaviors is the brain, its structure and function. So that's it's a phenotype, right? The brain underlies what we see expressed as behavior. And what contributes to structure and function is the interaction between genetic predispositions and environmental factors. And under environment, you see adversity with an arrow down, meaning all bad, and then resiliency, meaning all good, right? So you've got a lot of resiliency factors, strong, involved parenting, good, well-equipped schools, good inhibition, good self-regulation, adversity factors, child maltreatment and neglect and poverty and so forth. But what's in between this are epigenetic modifications, which, in shorthand means that the environment has the ability to affect the way genes are expressed or suppressed. And so this is really key. Ultimately, it's, what we can do with environmental manipulations is it can really profoundly affect us. And that's why prevention is so important. And it provides opportunities for intervention all along the way on this spectrum. So we know that adolescence is a developmental disease, addiction is a developmental disease, not adolescence. Addiction is a developmental disease that starts in childhood into adolescence. This figure simply shows that, 67%, this is a little old figure, 67% of those who onset in the teenage years, sorry, I'm not saying that right, 67% of use onsets in the teenage years. 26% onsets a little bit later in early adulthood, and then it gets to be much less. So the point here is that adolescence is when we see this huge growth in substance use. So adolescence is a risk factor, adolescence in and of itself. So what about adolescence? And what does it take to get to adolescence? So, what we've been pointing out here is that there are pathways from early childhood, even conception, if you will, that lead to whether adolescents can successfully navigate those teen years and avoid substance use disorders. And it starts early. And that's the point. These pathways to behavioral mental wellness start early. So at each stage of development, it's associated with an expected ability to have certain intellectual abilities, to develop language, cognitive control, and so forth. All of these things must be met to reduce later risk. So these things have to begin to become developed and evolve earlier in life before we even get to adolescence. So the regulatory systems that are critical to success in adolescence develop before the age of 11. And all of these systems here that I have listed are regulatory systems that need to begin to develop before age 11. They need to be in place. And then if they are in place, these milestones in adolescence can be met, and they are all integral to the self-regulation of emotion behavior. So as you see here, conflict resolution, impulse control, problem solving, and so forth, all are established on the basis of what children learn and are exposed to earlier in life. And then when you get to adolescence, people say, well, isn't it too late? Oh my, no. So much development is taking place in adolescence. There's an absolute explosion of what's going on in the brain in adolescence. So two important things are happening involving the prefrontal cortex, which is shown here in orange, where patterns of activation within the prefrontal cortex become more focused, more attentive, more efficient during adolescence. But it's not yet fully connected to lower parts of the brain, like the limbic system, where emotion is modulated. And so during adolescence, it's a process of becoming increasingly connected between the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain that control emotion that you see here, largely in yellow, but there are other parts here that are very much involved in this connectivity that's happening during adolescence. And all of this supports cognitive control over emotion responses, which are absolutely key to avoiding substance use. So what does the prefrontal cortex do? It modulates executive functions. And here are some examples of executive functions. And it is the ability to meet these developmental milestones that executive cognitive functions set you up for. So as they mature throughout adolescence, you're more able to meet these developmental milestones and be healthy throughout adolescence. This is a figure similar to the one that Wilson showed. And I just want to make the point here that, brain development is very protracted. It's like I'm always telling my children, your brains aren't connected, so you can't make those decisions until you're about 30 years old, because it's a very protracted process of connectivity throughout adolescence. From a neurobiological perspective, we're really still adolescents until we're almost 30, when these circuits start to come together. So it means that, the adolescent brain under normative circumstances is a little imbalanced. And that's why we see more heightened risk behavior in adolescence than we do later in life, or even earlier in childhood. So there's sort of a double jeopardy here, where emotional responses are heightened, but cognitive controls are still immature and not well connected to the emotional centers of the brain. So this is all normative, and that's why most 16-year-olds drive like they're missing part of their brain. It's under construction here. It's a normative process. So, some generalizations about adolescents are that they usually, even though they're a little erratic and can be really emotional and impulsive and a bit risk-taking in adolescence, they generally do not develop serious problems, most of them. Most problems with respect to substance use are usually transitory. They experiment in adolescence and don't escalate and continue on to more serious problems. And not all problems begin in adolescence. Some of them begin much earlier in life, setting them up for not meeting their developmental milestones, right? Most problems do not persist into adulthood, and problems during adolescence are not caused by normative changes. Serious problems are not caused by normative changes. So what happens when conditions are non-normative and we have a delay in the way the prefrontal cortex is connected to limbic systems that control emotion? We get neurodevelopmental deficits and delays. So when the prefrontal cortex is slow to develop, or it's not developing or functioning properly, we get some of these issues that you see listed here. And what are the conditions that lead to this dysregulation that actually cause these changes in the brain so that the prefrontal cortex is less connected or less well developed? Adversity. Adversity is a major factor in this. And I wanted to show this picture because it's not only about what happens in the home, it's also about community level adversity. It's about racism, it's about violence, community violence, lack of opportunity, witnessing violence in the neighborhood, discrimination, poverty, and so forth. So these are all within the home and outside of the home, very important influences and have a tremendous impact on brain development. Interestingly, and I'll just mention this relatively quickly, is that stress in general, like really, severe or acute stress or chronic stress, affects the same systems that are affected by drugs of abuse. So stress actually has an impact on what we call the reward systems of the brain. And stress can damage these areas of the brain, causing more delays to the way the prefrontal cortex is developing and connecting. Interestingly, because it affects these reward systems, it can increase physiological sensitivity to drugs. So the mere exposure to stress throughout childhood can make you more sensitive to drugs when you use them. So they'll be more rewarding when you get into adolescence and just experiment, and could increase risk for escalation of use. Stress increases desire to improve mood with drug use after exposure to stress. It also disengages the coping mechanisms that you would normally have in place to get over stress and to deal with the environment. And it compromises the ability to make advantageous decisions and engage in healthy problem solving and conflict resolution. And these are all the same brain regions implicated in psychopathology. So psychopathology, stress, drug use, all impact the same neural circuitry. And it happens to be the same neural circuitry that's developing and is still vulnerable in adolescence. So stress more strongly predicts drug use when there is a psychiatric disorder on board, when there is poor parenting and so forth, and when there's poor self-regulation. Wilson showed something similar to this, just to say that children without maltreatment have all kinds of connectivity in their brain that support emotion and self-regulation. But when maltreated, you can see that the connectivity between really important nodes of the brain from the front of the brain to other areas of the brain are really sparse. So this has implications for how well children can navigate their environment. And then top-down control. So what we want to do in intervention is strengthen top-down control, prefrontal control over these lower systems. So we want to strengthen that so we can enhance self-regulation and enhance the ability to cope with stress. And that's what intervention basically seeks to do, preventive intervention and also later intervention when we get into the therapy realm. And that effective programs, we are discovering, capitalize on the brain's plasticity that we've been talking about in terms of the neural circuitry supporting frontal control over emotions. And that the effects of intervention that enhance vertical control through practicing strategies in, and I have listed here just a few, awareness and attention to regulation of one's cognitions, their emotions and somatic sensations tend to have really remarkable impacts on the way the brain functions in subsequent behavior. And I'll just show you this. This is the way I take apart interventions to determine what I can expect to see in the brain and then subsequent behavioral outcomes. So the PAS program is a very effective program, positive alternative thinking strategies. So I pulled apart, what is it that it's supposed to be acting on theoretically? What are these different components of the program trying to do? Reinforce attention, helping children learn how to problem solve, self-regulate, and so forth. And so what does that mean? Well, that means more vertical control in the brain, and it means increased vagal flow, which is the ultimate substrate of attention and emotion regulation. And so I'm looking at the brain and I'm looking at stress physiological systems. And then we can expect to see improved behavioral outcomes in effect. And so I take apart the program components, I map them to what they are supposed to be doing on the individual level. I determine the physiological systems that support those changes, and then I determine what we're supposed to see in terms of improved outcomes for children. And I do that with a number of different kinds of interventions. So I'm not going to focus on this, but I just want to, because we're going to hear from our next speaker significantly about this, but over 90 effective policies and programs have been shown to be evidence-based. They improve behavioral health. And these are programs that are available all across development, okay? Prevention measures that have been shown to work. I'm not sure of my timing here. Matej, give me a heads up here.
Everything's fine, just continue.
Okay, I'm almost done. So prevention measures that have been shown to promote the development and the connectivity of the prefrontal cortex that may be effective interventions for risk, right? So for prevention include life skills training. It's a very good program, but also just in general life skills training. Mindfulness-based programs that I'm very enamored with, because in adults, mindfulness-based programs, there are literally dozens of studies now that are showing that they increase neural connectivity, they increase gray matter density, and cortical thickness. It's all very important in the brain's connectivity. And these improve attention, impulse control, and emotion regulation. And so I love these programs, and we're doing research in adolescents now to establish the impacts on their physiology of yoga and meditation and breath work. Programs also that focus on positive rewards tend to be most effective for the highest risk kids. Compassion and self-compassion interventions are a new interest of mine, given what they do in adults, and we want to see what they do in adolescents with respect to brain function and physiology. Instilling healthy habits and skills around emotion regulation. And then finally, prompting selective salience, which is like using, I don't know if you've heard of ecological momentary assessments, but you can use these assessments with your having, well, you like, let's say a Fitbit or a cell phone that is texting you messages during periods where you're wanting to engage in high risk behavior, and it gets you back, to where you should be with respect to good decision making. They're being used with respect to craving in individuals that are withdrawing or to avoid relapse in individuals who are in treatment, and so forth. So these are also potentially very effective for prevention. So our call to action, I'm just going to say we have two calls to action here. We don't want to just respond to when people are at risk and try to ameliorate or redirect trajectories that are already going awry. We want to reduce the initial risk of exposure to contributing conditions in the first place. And by that, we need comprehensive programming that is scaled up, that is out there for all, that are systematically delivered. We also want to engage in practices that reinforce nurturing environments where children can thrive. And we want to focus on policies that can help to sustain and really institutionalize these practices. And then the second line of defense is when we've missed, and we have to look at the consequences of exposure of adversity on health and development, and how we can improve and redirect and normalize these developmental trajectories. So prevention is timeless. Even young children can manifest early signs. So it's really important that we recognize the early signs and that we intervene early. And conditions within and surrounding the caregiving environment are key determinants of health outcomes. So that's another takeaway that I think is very important. We also, another takeaway is that we know how to prevent. We know how to prevent the full range of problems. We just really need to invest as governments, invest as social institutions and sectors, invest as communities, and invest as adults that have an influence over children, that we invest in these practices so they can reach their highest potential. And I just said the next the next one already. And in all cases and at all ages, an enriched environment, external supports, and high quality education is essential. So it's important that we get these messages across to our policymakers. And I want to really emphasize that it's never too late. Yes, we need to intervene as early as possible and make sure conditions are ripe for healthy development, but it's not too late in adolescence. It's a really exciting opportunity. I see adolescence as an opportunity for intervention. And so here's my address and my coalition website. I'm at the University of North Carolina, in case you didn't see it earlier, at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. So I will stop.
Okay, thank you, Danny. Thanks for your valuable and very interesting presentation. I always learn something new from you, so I wrote some good points in my notes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you always have to listen and get some new ideas how you can intervene. But there are two questions already in the Q&A. So the first one is how to help a small child to self-regulate.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading the chat. How to get a small child to self-regulate?
Yes.
A calm and soothing environment. So I don't know how small we're talking. If we're talking about before toddlerhood, there needs to be a lot of close, warm parenting, tactile, the touch of a parent, the smile. If we're talking about babies, the smile, the attentiveness, I guess basically being responsive to a child's cues is very, very important. As they get a little bit older, once they're toddlers and they're starting to speak and they're having temper tantrums, a really good rule of thumb is to sit quietly, not mirror their emotion, but instead help them to borrow from the adult self-control, so that they can learn by modeling, and they can learn by there's something called physiological co-regulation, where a child can really pick up on a parent's physiology. And you can see that if a parent is upset, even a baby will respond to that parent's upsetness. So if you model calmness and your own self-control and are responsive to the child, to that child's emotion, they will respond. And touch, soothing, calm, quiet environments is really important when they're really small. When they get a little bit older and they're starting to get maybe a little defiant and strong-willed and everything is upsetting them, so we're talking, even 9, 10, 11, 12, then it's really important to validate them. And this might seem strange, but what adults tend to do is impose our own feelings and impressions on our children, and in whatever setting we're in, whether we're in school or at home, teachers, parents, therapists and others to say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Or it wasn't that bad, or why don't you just get over it? All those kinds of responses that adults tend to have. And instead say, you must feel horrible. That was a terrible thing that happened, and really help to validate their feelings. And I will guarantee you that unless there's an emotional disturbance, right, on board, that they will calm down and they will appreciate and begin to learn how to self-regulate that emotion. You just calmly sit with them and say, I understand. I commiserate. Let's see how we can get through this. But don't even do the problem-solving thing at first. Recognize their emotion. So at different developmental stages, it requires obviously a different tact and a different set of language cues, because infants are going to understand that. But even in small children are going to understand the noises that you make. And if you utter soothing, calming noises, there will be, and that's how you really strengthen the development of that connectivity that I was talking about from the prefrontal cortex. And that has been shown in research to really nurture brain development through parent and even teacher interactions with children.
Yeah, thank you. Great. I will use this, your advice with my 5-year-old son.
Oh, good.
Already today. So
Good. Just keep your cool.
Yeah. That's very good advice, especially for parents, but also I would say for teachers in schools, when they struggle with some children with difficulties. Yeah, okay, let's see another question. It's about institutionalized treatment of adolescents. Do you believe that institutionalized treatment of adolescents who suffer from addiction worsens their long-term chances of recovery because of how they are socially excluded? Should governments focus on funding out of institution treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I would, basically, unless there is really a safety concern, and and not just harm to others, but a safety concern in terms of suicidal ideation, and attempts and feelings and things like that, then there might be a need for a more secure environment. But of course, that environment needs to be inherently a caretaking environment. It can't be an institutional type environment, right? That is the worst thing to do. And so, I would strongly emphasize the need to deinstitutionalize treatment. So what I'm assuming here, and I can't see the question anymore. Oh, let me see it in the answer. It was answered, that in the context of substance use, oh no, I'm looking at the wrong set of questions so far. Okay, in the context of addiction, I just wanted to make sure what stage of substance use we're talking about. That it is very important to have adolescents in group and social settings. Now, sometimes there is contamination when there is a, when there is a very toxic sort of interaction between adolescents, where you have adolescents that are more further along in their addiction, and they can contaminate the others in the group. You have to be careful that everybody's on the same page in that group. But I think group settings are absolutely essential, and that the institutionalization of treatment has been very harmful. It's been very harmful for adults and more harmful for adolescents, who literally need social interaction and peer relationships to function and for their brains to develop normally. Literally essential in adolescence. And so I do think that, out of institution treatments are essential, and that it does not help recovery to be an inpatient. But in the initial stages of addiction, just, going through withdrawal, it could be very important to be in more of a hospital setting to get through withdrawal, and then gradual re-engagement with their community, right? So it all needs to be staged. But when you say institutional, I shudder, because I know what some of these institutions are like. But again, in a hospital for withdrawal, and definitely in a hospital setting if there's suicidal ideation of any sort or threats of harm to others, but with gradual release back into a normal environment where they can continue to be treated and supported in community-based intervention facilities.
That's great advice for our authorities all around the world.
Yes.
Yeah, then the last question in the Q&A is, do you think conduct disorder as classified by DSM-5 as a very prevalent mental health disorder can be analyzed with the use of this study? Then what is the prognosis of substance use disorder in this study?
So conduct disorder in the study. So I guess when you say study, you mean the program of research,
yes.
Right? The overall program of research. So conduct disorder is the most predictive disorder in terms of substance use. Substance use disorder, conduct disorder is a very strong predictor. And many other risk factors in terms of individual level risks fall out when you have conduct disorder in the statistical model, because it is such a strong predictor. And I don't know that it is a very prevalent, it's not like, anxiety and depression are much more prevalent than conduct disorder. But unless there's intervention with conduct disorder, the prognosis can be very poor. And there is much more of a heightened risk for a trajectory towards addiction when conduct disorder is not addressed. It is a very strong predictor. But and like I said, it's not nearly as prevalent as some other mental health disorders. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very strong predictor. So that is without a doubt, but also depression, anxiety. It's just, there's a subset of individuals with conduct disorder that have callous unemotional traits. And I want to say, I don't remember the exact statistic, but most of them will develop substance use disorders if they have callous unemotional traits. And they have been distinguished by a different way of their brains have developed differently. Their physiology is different. Their cognition is different. Their personality and their psychological status is different. So on just about every domain, individuals with callous unemotional traits are different, and they have a risk for becoming what we call psychopathic. And psychopaths are also at very, very high risk for substance use disorder. And so it is extremely, extremely important that we do identify these individuals that are such high risk and get good intervention to them. I want to give you a caveat, however, is that we don't yet know exactly how to reach conduct disordered patients. And I would implore NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and other institutes to focus a bit more on the neurobiological pathways to substance use in conduct disordered individuals, so that we then identify program components that will better target that disorder. Because right now it's very murky. The only basic principle that we know is that positive rewards that are built into intervention seem to work best with those with conduct disorder, but we don't yet really know how to reach them. More research is needed. Thank you for that important question.
Yeah, thank you. It's always also good to have new challenges for the future. So this is one of the most important of them. Yeah, I will take this opportunity and ask you maybe the last question in this session. I know you promote quite a lot of social and emotional learning, empathy, mindfulness, etc., as a beneficial to children and also parents and teachers as well. So how would you approach to the school authorities or Ministry of Education? What would they benefit from such kind of interventions? Because we struggle quite a lot here in Slovenia to convince them that this is a good investment in social and emotional learning, teachers' well-being, etc. So I would really like to hear from you. What would you recommend to
Yes.
as an approach?
Yeah, so we are doing this work in schools, and schools have embraced it. There's more and more research and more evidence that mindfulness type interventions such as that, and are they really interventions? They're practices that can be embedded, infused into the school curriculum, into the school day, right? They don't need to be an intervention, which interventions aren't going to have population level effects.
Yeah, I agree.
It's the practices that we can thread into our daily activities, into our schools. And so schools have really started to embrace this. So we have not had any problem from a research perspective, having schools embrace these practices so we can study their effects on children. We've gone down as low as 8, but it should be in kindergarten. And there are folks here in the United States, and actually they work all around the world now to bring these practices to school systems that are very willing to embrace them. We can expect benefits such as better classroom management,
Yes.
much more amenability to learning, more stress coping skills, better social emotional skills, the ability of teachers, because teachers should have it too, right? It's not just for the children, it's for maybe all of us. I personally need to be more mindful. I need more training, but we all could benefit from this. If teachers and children alike have this training, the studies are starting to show that children do better and teachers are reinforced by it because it improves their ability to teach so fundamentally. I could go on about that and would love to, have an opportunity for more exchange. And I can send you some research findings. I can distill them. So I'm not sending you a bunch of papers, right, that you can't get through in a million years because it takes so long. But I can distill that, but it's shown to be very beneficial all around for this to really be incorporated into a school curriculum. There's some schools in the United States that have mindful moments where they do breathing and a little bit of meditation at the beginning of the day. And these are in the highest risk schools by virtue of high levels of poverty and trauma. And do these mindful moments, and you can see the difference.
Yeah, I would just use this opportunity and read a comment from the chat. It would be beneficial if the faculty of pedagogics, future teachers, education, would embrace this kind of approach. So this is not just, bringing to schools, but before.
Yeah. I am very optimistic that this will happen.
Yeah.
I think it'll take a few more years,
sooner
but
or later.
I think we're on our way.
Yeah, this is also a work in progress here in Europe. We are part of one project which is focusing on teachers' well-being. So this is something which will go further for sure in the next few years. Okay, so thank you very much. Shall we take a few minutes break with it so people can stretch and move a little bit around? My watch is reminding me that I have to stretch a little bit. So I'm sitting for too long. So if you agree, we would take 5 minutes break, and in this is now 4:52. We are back.
With pleasure. It's a seminar on health prevention and action, so we cannot.
Yeah, we have to use this opportunity also to have some physical activities. So in 5 minutes we are back. Thank you. Okay, great. Let's continue with our webinar. We are just on time, maybe a few minutes late because of this short break, but it was very needed. And I would like to introduce a good friend of mine, Wadih Maalouf from UNODC, from office which is responsible for prevention as well. And I'm quite sure that a lot of people, at least here in Slovenia and neighboring countries, know Wadih quite well. You were able to listen to many of his presentations, and this one will be connected with brain development. It will be about a theological model in the context of UNODC WHO International Prevention Standards. So I'm really happy to have you and introduce you and give you the floor, Wadih, to start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matej, and thank you for all colleagues that stay and are listening to this. Thank you for organizing, but also a big thanks through you to Slovenia in general for being that supportive to social emotional learning and prevention in general and early prevention intervention, not only in the context of this webinar, but I know very well that in the communication we have in the context of even the which means in a way infecting, let's say, positively infecting other member states as well to listen to this prevention. This is much highly appreciated. And hopefully through you we will have even more friends within the city and beyond, given the diversity of audience. I've been given the challenging task not only to present at the end, but after a very interesting presentation, but to present after two heavyweights in the field of prevention, both institutionally and on the personal level. Two colleagues that really come within the same mindset that the prevention standards emanates from. So it's not an easy task at all. But what I'll try to do, given that it is the last presentation in this series, and given that there's a lot of similarity in the messages that are being echoed, I thought maybe it's better to bring that discussion that was presented by Wilson and Diana to the level of like how this is being translated, transmitted to policymakers through the prevention standards in terms of, okay, this is the science, this is what we know, this is what you should do, sort of a model of presentation. And hopefully it will address a kind of an additional to the very positive light and very enlightening light that was presented by Wilson. So we in World Dog Day, it happens on June 26. This year, the campaign of UNODC centers around share facts on drugs, saving lives, meaning that the science that is orbiting around the drugs, both on the epidemiological side as science related to the response side, is key in order to save lives. And I think the context of saving lives in the current that we are all going in is a key component, not only that reflects the value of health responses, but I think the value of prevention responses in that context have been a very valuable lesson learned for investment purposes. So yes, the prevention standard is an entry point for us, Bible, and that international is the result of, it has the logo of UNODC or WHO because we've used our criteria of assessing evidence, WHO evidence. But really the science is not the UNODC or WHO science, it's the science that is emanating from a various heavyweight institutions of science, including NIDA, including the MCDDA, CCAD, the Canadian Census Abuse, and more, but also and lots of experts and researchers. And Diana is no stranger to this because she was a key contributor as well for the prevention standards development and more, and you as well was a key contributor to it. So that science exists. I cannot go into details of it because essentially the content of it has been presented already. But I will go into sound bits of specific messages that are important to remember when we're doing interventions or prevention. The question of return on investment was raised during the discussions, but it's important to remember that not investing in prevention also comes at a cost. And it's a hefty cost. It's bigger than the cost of investing in it. So, and you saw the data and you saw what has been presented to this effect, really highlighting the value of addressing childhood adversities and beyond. But also when investing in this, the high return on investing that can be done. Not any investment in prevention is effective. So it's important to reflect that out of, regardless of the good willingness of people, there is a science behind prevention, and not everything that is labeled prevention is actual prevention. Prevention should lie on the science that's been presented by Wilson and Diana before. So not only the of the ecological model that had helped design specific programs is important, but there's an additional kind of a big array of science that have taken that ecological model, developed program designed to address a logical framework of operation emanating from this ecological model, documenting a specific impact on making the changes both at the mediating level, which is changing the variables that would cause of higher risk, as well as changing the actual substance use on the long term that's documented. So there is no need to improvise unless you are dealing with subpopulation where there is no actual packages of prevention that have been designed yet. And this is where you can be guided by the science and create something new. Another message that is said in the prevention standards is that prevention is not only talking about drugs. And that's the key message that has been displayed so far. We're talking of a brain that's developing over time, and the presentation was here, including from Wilson, the current research of discussing almost at the embryonic level intervention that prevents substance use at a later stage, that we're not only discussing drugs, and we're not raising fears about drugs. We're discussing something that goes beyond this. And if there are specific packages that raise awareness about drugs, this would only deal with a small clientele of beneficiaries that could benefit from this at a specific age. But the spectrum of beneficiaries intervention spans way beyond what is considered by policymakers. Another important message that is part of the standards that we really like to echo again and again, particularly when we're talking about children and adolescents. And really, Diana's presentation was clear in the sense of when initiation of substance use occurs. We're talking about a window of time that's developmentally strategic for us, which is early to late adolescence. We're talking about, and the presentation of Wilson talked about like what brain exists in the developmental stages within that age. We're talking about a population that the decision-making process is not completely a free, independent decision-making processes. So basically, these messages of just say no to drugs is a bit limited in terms of scope. Might affect few people, but these people might not use drugs even without absence of the message. If we're really talking about the people that needs that preventive message, that vulnerability that we talked about in a few steps forward, but we already discussed in a way, just saying no messages is something that is touching the surface of the vulnerability matrix that we would like to address. So another key message also to remember with the prevention standard is that many policymakers, when they're doing intervention, they see like, I have a problem with drug X and like smoking. I have a problem with new psychoactive substances, with cocaine, a specific substance, with marijuana. Yet, when the point of focus of the problem is the drug, and you're designing prevention with the drug being the problem of focus, then of course, most of the intervention will be focusing around awareness raising, supply reduction, control mechanisms, laws and legislation relating to the drug. And just probably messages that within this framework, but when the frame operation, when the mindset is open that it's not the drug, that's the issue now in the prevention context, the drug is an issue. If I focus my intervention on the individual and I want to help that individual grow in a healthy and safe way, then the sort of programming that's being addressed will shift in terms of paradigm from a set of messages that focus on dealing drug, but to sets of packages that deal with milestones of development at different stages of development, and how can I help that child grow in a healthy and safe way at each developmental stage to avoid any risky behavior, including potentially substance use at a specific age. So that's why it comes sometimes as a surprise for policymakers that we're working with that many of the prevention programs that I mentioned have passed the threshold of science of WHO standards for documented on substance use prevention that do not discuss drugs at all. There is nothing about drugs, no awareness raising or anything. There might be some of them have. I'm not saying all of them don't discuss drugs at all. And they help the intellectual, language, cognitive, emotional, and social competency skills that are needed at every single age of development in a way to let the child grow in a healthy and safe way. And that's an essential component, not only from the perspective of expanding the age groups dealing with and changing the mindset of the policymakers in terms of what kind of programs can be availed, but also from a perspective that these packages really help avoid risky behaviors that go way beyond just substance use. And that's the value of the return of investment we get from these programs, because substance use is one issue, but also these same packages include violence against children, mental health, poor school attendance, poor educational attendance, poor mental health, and beyond. So that is a key thing to reflect that prevention should be multi-setting. So basically, if you want to help the child grow, yeah, there is a certain way the family can help, there's a certain way the school can help, there's a certain way the community can help, there's a certain way the individual needs to help himself or herself. So basically, there needs to be a couple of settings implicated. That's where the message of like it takes a village to raise a child comes. And the other important message is that we are helping that child from birth onward to help his or her brain socialize in a positive way to avoid risky behaviors. That's an issue that has been raised also, that these vulnerabilities that we're dealing with are not unique to substance use initiation. That vulnerability matrix, including for us as GMC, we are the Office on Drugs, and so we deal with several thematics, not only drugs. We also need we deal with crime, with sometimes human trafficking. So there is that context of stress and conflicts, issues that we deal with in the different thematic mandates that we have. But regardless, when we deal within these packages, maybe crime, violence, drug use, the vulnerability matrix, social model perspective has a lot of commonalities in terms of to be addressed in youth in order to prevent it from happening, violence, drugs, and crime. And the most important message that I understand it is that, well, there is science of effective responses. There is also a big science that exists not only on ineffective responses, but also on responses that are iatrogenic. And I think this is something that Matej, you alluded to in the beginning, where there is, out of all the intentions, no prevention policymaker has bad intention in terms of investing in prevention. But out of all the good intention, when science is not really the core of what is being proposed, there are certain interventions that it is the intervention itself that has caused the risk to occur, and its absence would have been more beneficial than its presence. And that's what the iatrogenic effect we're talking about. And also, the lack of effectiveness is also ethically, from an investment perspective, wrong, because if you want to invest and you know that the science exists, you better as much also invest in the science that you can guarantee can give you a return and a positive outcome, because you're investing in the health and welfare of children. So the basic science is what has been discussed so far. The brain, from when it's hardware being developed and it's in the womb as genetic codes, up to where it's exposed environment around it to adapt its software in terms of and evolve with age in terms of its, is always in the context of socializing to the environment around it, to adapt itself and to learn new skills, and certain things to be developed, certain things that have innate in the individual that can adapt and socialize, but certain assistance in terms of support needs to happen in the environment around that child. And also, there are certain instances where the environment around the child causes a negative support mechanism as well. So this is, in a nutshell, the vulnerability matrix that we showcase to policymakers to tell them what needs to be done. Every single person has a different characteristic from his or her, to the mental health traits that the person has, to the activity of stress, to neurological development. Even within the same family, brothers and sisters can vary in terms of who they are as a person. And who they are as a person is also interacting with the environment around. And there are social institutions, every single individual, that influence, positive or a negative way, these personal characteristics in terms of activating or deactivating them. So family and social institution, and how the family interacts with that individual. Lack of involvement, monitoring, harsh parenting, negative role modeling. These are all the negative traits, but also positive parenting exists, and this can attenuate also negative personal characteristics. So it's an interactive modality of work. School is an important institution, and school is an institution that goes beyond just educating children, but the quality of the education carries also an effect. The school climate carries effect. The quality of attendance, reaching schools and accessing schools, the school itself, how it operates, how it's managed classroom-wise is important. Peers also are these are all microstructure, but these microstructure exist in a larger macro environment that also affect how these micro institutions are relating with the person, the characteristic that the person has. They might carry the micro level characteristic, might carry a direct effect also on the person, the characteristic. But you can imagine a family living in conflict, displacement is different than a family that's parenting in normal circumstances. And schools that are operating in difficult, low socioeconomic status, dissociated societies where there's lots of violence are different than other schools that deals with a different community setting. So basically, these are interacting with each other. So that's in the framework that really determines a characteristic that is linked to ability that might express itself into substance use and beyond. As I said, it could be violence, it could be other things, that the materialization could go beyond. So we go back to the policymaker and imagine, and I tell them, imagine for an instance that there is this child that is aggressive, that is, that is sensation seeking, that has high reactivity to stress, living in a very kind of a chaotic family where there's lots of problems in terms of skills and domestic violence, let's say, within the family, with poor access to schools, and living in a situation of conflict or displacement. And your prevention, and this is actually the target child that you want to prevent from using substance or engaging in risky behavior, and you're orbiting your prevention strategy around the context of just say no to drugs, or this is what that substance is and it's dangerous and don't use it. It's very, it orbits between ethically wrong up to a very naive way of dealing with the problem that is much more complex than this, knowing that there are programs that can help that child with the personal vulnerability and the macro level vulnerability that's around them. So that's the core message that we want to highlight for policymakers, because this is also important within the sustainability development goal context, that all UN agencies are supporting countries between now and 2030, that this sort of paradigm of thinking really helps develop. Even if you're coming in from a drug prevention angle, go beyond this, and you can be supporting through this quality education, gender equality. You might be supporting 16, particularly on the violence front. So basically, doing one intervention can support many other targets that are linked with sustainable development. Also, a simple slide maybe, but it's an important thing that this prevention is not a standalone response. This is a response that part of the response that the health for drugs and beyond. So basically, there are interventions that are promotional in terms of health promotion, but within prevention as well, there are certain packages that are for everyone. There are certain that are universal, certain packages that are selective, meaning for us are higher risk than the normal population, and there are indicated level of prevention, which is in most cases when there's a symptomatic thing that starts showing in specific, let's say, a youth or children that requires early intervention before it escalates to something that requires a clinical treatment or other sort of treatment. These packages are linked with the treatment response and the maintenance response going beyond. So the prevention response is integrated for a prevention strategy, but that prevention strategy is also part of a larger response strategy that the country should have, and it's not a standalone by itself. So this goes into the main framework that was presented by Diana in a way that the prevention standards also talks to member states. So basically, now that you have this paradigm in mind, remember that you can start from stages, from infancy up to adulthood in terms of evidence-based responses for preventing substance use. You have many social institutions that we can deal with, families, schools, community, workplace, and the health sector. At least this is where we have determined. And then you have interventions that are green, meaning universal. Some of them are universal and selective, which is the yellow, and some of them are indicated level in terms of to know how to prioritize yourself in terms of diverting which program to which sub-community of work. There is a lot you can do, and there is no need to improvise. So if we start seeing this from, I'm going to usually do the different way of presenting this. I'm going to talk to it from a perspective of, let's talk about a child that's developing and see how we can help that child in different ages of development. So basically, when we're talking about prenatal and infancy stages, we're talking about a child that's just been born or a pregnant mother in an embryonic stage or just been born, and that child is opening his eyes to the world, is unable to communicate, and is going to learn how to communicate from the outside surrounding. And that's outside surrounding or might not be receptive or cognizant of how to deal with that child. So what kind of program packages can be availed at this stage of life to help the child reach the milestones of development? So some programs that have presented are prenatal and infancy visitation programs. So basically, as you will see from the slide, these are in yellow. So most of the interventions here cannot intervene on all children everywhere, but most of the interventions we're talking about are in yellow, which means in selective subpopulation, population at higher risk than the normal population. I'm talking probably low socioeconomic status or concentration or conflict. There is a stress environment around the child. So basically, trained nurses or social workers like visiting mothers and giving the mothers the parenting skills that they need at this specific age, including other social packages of health, housing, employment, legal advice, and beyond. I'm not gonna, there are several brands of packages within this. Is the idea of the package in terms of a developmental perspective. What are we working with? The prevention standard gives you the components that makes the strategy work and do not work for you to orient yourself in terms of responses. And these are specific for women considered at higher risk than the normal mothers are parenting in normal circumstances. And then also something that sometimes need to consider is treatment for pregnant women with substance use disorder, because parenting in many instances and other faculties might be compromised because of substance. So this is in a stage where you're dealing with the person that for a drug treatment perspective, but also that person as a parent. So this is an opportune time for interventions for mothers and their future children to help, giving them treatment and care services, and also support these women with safety, education, employment, and beyond. And also provide basic skills within this context of the packages that are done. So basically, a treatment intervention for certain individual is accompanied by a prevention package that support the other person within the family. Service for pregnant women in general as well. Alcohol and other drug use for pregnancy poses also a potential health risk, even in the absence of substance use disorder, and can help mothers during their pregnancy to kind of in an appropriate way to avoid any sort of problem with children and or beyond. It could be provided for all pregnant women, but it's but sometimes also for a selective term, it could be also on a selective basis. So if we move from that stage of development to an age of development where the child is in early childhood, what do we mean? We're not categorizing ages really now by numbers, but in terms of developmental stage. We're talking about a child now that is at a stage where he or she can communicate, but is not in school yet. So the child is being prepared to go to school. So this is an age where early education programs can be availed to support, particularly we're talking still on a selective basis, because of course anybody can benefit from it, but on a selective basis in situation where there's sub-communities of, let's say, deprived, having their children there, some packages that can help the parents support the child to prepare him or her to go to school. Preschool sort of children, we're talking 2 to 5 years. This example of one of the packages that have been availed under that modality, where a very early childhood education, you're talking about 2 to 3 years old, 4 years old children, were availed a program to prepare them really to go to school, in improving their basic learning from, you know, this is big, this is small, this is preparing them of, you know, learning this is what this is how I feel, sort of programmatic approaches, preparing the child to go to school really. And these children were followed up to the year of when they were 21 to see how that intervention, when it was randomized between the blue and the red, which is a case and control group, to see that preparation at an early stage to go to school packages, how did it affect that at the age of 21? And you will see not only substance use was cut in half in the intervention group to the control group, but also that same assistance helped other behavior at risk to be prevented. For example, becoming a teenage parent yourself at the age of 20. Also, positively, getting enrolled in college, if you were exposed at that very early stage of development, getting enrolled in college or university compared to if you were not when you were in that same community of deprivation. So you will see the value of these very early interventions where substance use is not discussed at all. How can it help the children at a very late stage? So if we move to middle childhood, we're talking about an age now where the children most of the time move from their parents to school. So they're in a new social environment where they need additional sort of skill to kind of integrate with this larger group of social network that they're exposed to. And these are the kind of packages that can be available from the middle childhood perspective. Parenting becomes because you know, help you know, packages to help parents better in a safer way, improves children bonding, relationship. These same packages can be available for the later age, but even at that age, they're very important, can be delivered on a universal or selective basis. But how to kind of positively communicate, monitor your child in a healthy and safe and provide discipline in an age-appropriate way, set rules in an appropriate way, is an important characteristic that discipline is also reflected in a good way in schools. And for instance, families and schools together is one of the packages that we were working with in terms of promoting it as a program for early childhood, early age years, school years implementation. And in different settings, check the differentiation in terms of effect on different factors like family relationship, the total difficulties on the strength and difficulty questionnaires that the parents see, pro-social behavior. I will not go into the details, but coincidentally, we had two schools, two groups of schools that, you know, are more or less the same ages in Iran. The difference between the two schools is one of them was a school that is catering for a high socioeconomic status group, and one of them was catering for a lower socioeconomic schools, the kindergarten subgroup in red. And coincidentally, we saw that those that were more deprived benefited more from the same packages at the community level from those that were not, which is also a significant thing to reflect on as a policymaker, that these packages help all children, but also help more the children that are more, not say probably vulnerable, but more living in more vulnerable circumstances than the others. And in addition, benefiting about these packages of family and parenting skills that we're promoting a lot, and Matej knows the kind of work we're doing on this front, but they're important because also they're gender sensitive. So they benefit both boys and girls, which is not something we can say for all packages of prevention. And that's why it's something also from a programmatic approach is also important to reflect on the gender perspective of the response that we do. Are we making the same effect for boys and girls, and what packages I need to avail to really have a beneficial effect on both genders? Another set of packages are social skills. Now, the family is a structure around the child that we can support resilience over and beyond the individual resilience. Now we're talking about packages that develop the resilience in the person, in the individual. And these are packages that, where trained teachers start engaging in an interactive way with the children to support the social and emotional competency that is needed in that age of development. It differs. There are packages for early school years, but there are packages for adolescents at the later school years as well that can be developed. It's the same concept, but the different content of the packages, addressing the social and emotional competency that are needed at a specific age through an interactive group work where kids start supporting each other, mediated and facilitated by a trained teacher or another social worker within the school, and that it can be delivered universally. And they do not, of course, especially at an early age, we're talking about early school, they don't contain information of drugs. This is an example from the years, for example, where children are taught how to make new friends and learn the schools, how to manage your own anger, how to see the emotion, the anger emotion in the other kids, and stop before and reflect on it, communication skills, how to listen, speak up, give compliments, that sort of skills that are needed from a socialization perspective. And imagine a child going in for the school from are competent by themselves, but some of them need that extra boost of help to really engage socially and help their brain socialize beyond just learning math and biology and whatever they're learning at this age. So this is how an example where for a child, they will tell them like, okay, how to stop, recognize that there's anger on the recipient end, stop, go inside your shell as a turtle, take a deep breath, calm down, and try again before you react to that emotion. Skill, but it's an important skill at that age. It's important to reflect here on the point that when I'm talking about parenting and family skills and life skills education, from the perspective that these same packages are common denominators for many big interagency initiatives. So I'm discussing them from the drug prevention perspective, from part of the international standards. But the INSPIRE initiative, example of ending violence against, which is every single acronym of INSPIRE, is one of the strategies, but the P is for parenting and caregiving support, and the E is education and life skills. You will see that these packages are ultimately linked with the interagency work on ending violence against children. The WHO prevention of youth violence as well integrate the value of life skills and parenting skills as part of the youth engagement in violence. The guideline on mental health, the HAT, Helping Adolescents WHO initiative on promoting and preventing mental health in adolescents include life skills and parenting skills. The violence prevention extremism sort of work, recruitment, particularly of children perspective, could also contain childhood these sort of resilience skills to resist social pressures. So these are common denominators for many other strategies that you have at the common national level. So we're still in the age of early schools. Classroom environment management are also features where the teacher is taught how to manage the class in a more efficient and effective way. sometimes changing the school structure. These programs facilitate academic and social learning. So basically, and demonstrated by an example through the good behavior game. The good behavior game is a process where kids in the school are reshuffled in terms of where they're sitting, and as well as the assessment level of the teacher's assessment in terms of attention or disruption in terms of classroom. So high attention with low attention, those that are in the back, those in the front, in different sort of groups, and then they become teams. And each team, and there are class rules, and each team is rewarded or not given reward based on the team support of each other in terms of respecting these rules. So basically, you're changing, you're giving your class, but at the same time, you're supporting children to support themselves in order to abide by these class rules. So you're changing to manage your own classroom, and it would help kids supporting each other, while at the same time, the retention, the assimilation of information that's being provided in the classroom, and the attention of the kids is improved. So that's a model of a program that can be provided in perspective. And you will see that these kind of programs have been documented to provide also a reduction on the aggression rate that is in classrooms that are particularly having higher indicator of aggression in different, this is in grade 1, for example. Things to keep children in schools are very important. So basically, school attendance, attachment to school, policies are really, particularly in low middle income countries, we're talking about the actually building of schools, providing school meals, conditional cash transfers sort of modality where packages of social assistance is providing to the families on the condition to send their kids to school. These are things, you know, being in school for a child from a developmental perspective, that structure around the child is important from a brain development perspective to reshape the way it is socializing, moving forward for this. And all of these are key in this in prevention intervention. Addressing mental health disorders, and this is where we're starting to move indicated level of responses. So basically, if there are specific mental health problems that are indicated at an early stage level, it's important to reflect on the fact sometimes something that are missed in programming, that per UNICEF's work, almost half mental health disorders begin before 14. So these are important sort of statistics to address at a developmental level, but also from a perspective of preventing substance use for us, having indicated programs, which means programs to address these problems at an early stage, to support the kids in as early as possible from escalating to another problematic behavior are key. Early adolescence is where everyone knows more time what needs to be done, but I want to reflect on the earlier responses that exist so that we understand it, because in many cases, things that I mentioned are packages that are available through many ministries and for different purposes than substance use, but have never been geared to be used with a drug prevention strategy from a national perspective. And that sort of reflection is important in terms of how can I bring this ministry, let's say I'm the Ministry of Education and there is a Ministry of Social Affairs is doing social assistance packages. How can I, the Ministry of Social Assistance, understand that through bridging their strategy with me, I'm benefiting educational perspective, and the kids are raised in a more appropriate way, because we saw also from person's perspective that packages of addressing poverty, the children that are living in poor environment, there are lots of packages that can moderate the effect of poverty on the children. So basically, we can support the children directly from not having, the perspective of going into risky behavior because of the context that are living without really before, let's say, not without, because we still need to contain poverty environment, but before we can tackle poverty by itself, I can still help the child in that context that they're in to grow in a healthy and safe way and escape from it at a later stage. Early adolescence. Families are important in this age group. They're still relevant and they're still effective. Preventive education becomes most impacted, but the reason why I'm mentioning it here is like these social and emotional skills that are needed in early adolescence are different than an early age. So now we're talking about affinities, how to resist social pressure, like just say no, how to say no, how to critically think, how to cope with challenges in life. What normative belief, and what should I accept or not accept? So basically, I'm moving to an age. Sometimes we directly see peer pressure as offering the substance, and I need to learn the skill of how to say no. But sometimes that peer pressure is through normative belief. So basically, I am 14, 15, and I'm seeing the 17-year-old in front of me, and I get the perception that everybody that's 17 and 18 actually smokes. No one's a cigarette, but because I want to belong to this group, that's my normative belief. I want to be part of the majority. I want to smoke. And how can I make them understand that if you're not smoking, you are part of the majority, and it's the minority that is not. So all of these things are skills that needs to be developed. And this is where we can start discussing drug use, because this is when drug initiation and raising awareness from that perspective can be introduced. There can be also used for older adolescents. This is an example package of Unplugged, which is a package that probably you have in Slovenia and many other places in Europe, where you talk. Party tiger is, for example, you're at a party and somebody is at the party coming in and asking you to go and talk to another girl. How to sort of deal with this kind of difficult situation where you're not feeling comfortable without it, or like somebody is offering you a substance. How do you say no to this? By distracting that person, not only distracting him from you, but also trying to make that person not use it, him or herself. All of these, and in terms of critical thinking and decision making, and there's normative belief, how to challenge it. Our packages within 12 sessions that can be introduced to this effect. Lions Quest is another program that we have also support introducing. It's a bit larger than Unplugged, but it's all within the same concept. And this is information from Montenegro, for example. When you follow kids at the beginning of the academic year and at the end of the academic year, to see the difference in terms of marijuana use and as well alcohol and cigarettes. The slide on marijuana, to follow up what changed in the academic year between the intervention and the control group. And we see that the intervention group have increased in terms of their use of substances. And this is an additional side message to showcase the value of having a comparison group in our evaluation. But when we see the comparison group of other classrooms that did not take the package, you will see that the release rate is much shorter than those that took the pro package. I'm not into its details now. Policies, at an older adolescent, policies of substance use in school are important. So basically, policies that include and encompass everyone in the school, not only the students. From the management to everybody in school should abide by a school policy when it comes to substance use, as well as all the premises in and around the school. They should be non-punitive and intervention reversal, applying for everyone, but they could have also some selective components in terms of supporting early initiation within the school. But the main content of these packages to remember is that they should be packages to try to retain, particularly the kids that are more vulnerable in school as much as possible, because there are some policies that have been used in certain schools, for example, random urine testing and kicking the kids out that have been testing positive. But these are not modalities of implementation. We don't link to the policy of retaining the kids in school. The child needs assistance. So basically just kicking the child out is not the solution for the problem. And something deeper needs to be kind of embraced. And what is the overall strategy that I want to do in the classroom? There might be circumstances where there might be some children but it's the general concept in terms of theoretical framework that I'm putting for a policymaker of what needs to be done to be addressed. Because we're thinking about the child and the welfare of the child to grow in a healthy and safe way. Psychosocial vulnerability becomes important as well in this age in terms of dealing with them in the school. These are indicated level of intervention. School programs that improve attachment to school, student participation, positive bonding, commitment to school are also packages of importance in this age group. Mentoring could be considered as well, but these are also selective groups, selective intervention, where natural mentor is between an influential person and in terms of addressing pro-social attitudes in the children, but these are structured programs. It's not like a mentor and child. It should be in such a way to support kids in specific environment to move, particularly those that are living in marginalized circumstances, to move and to commit and spend more time in activities that are more mentored and dealt with by a person that is trained on the program, could be considered in this age group. Community-based multi-initiatives are things that bring the community around a concept of mobilized effort to create community partnership or task force to be a vehicle for evidence-based practices at the community level. So this spans across different age groups, and it's not specific to school or the family, but could embrace school-based activity or family-based activities. But the context of it is how to bring the community to mobilize its efforts and provide special programs of financial and technical support at the community level to kind of sustain these programs moving forward. So, and then there are programs for adolescents and adults where everything that's in early adolescence remain important during adolescence, from prevention, education, school policies, vulnerabilities, mentoring, and community initiatives. But also, this is where you reach an age where environmental policies become important. Alcohol policies, price tagging, and taxation, and tobacco, as well as raising the age, the prices for tobacco, as well as raising the minimum legal age for drinking. It's more on the drinking side than it's mixed results with regards to tobacco, because tobacco, taxation seems to be a bit more of an effective strategy than the age consumption. But are all environmental policies that can be considered. Advertisement and banning advertisement and what do you call it? Anything in terms of promotional things with regards to alcohol and tobacco are also become important. And the reason why alcohol and tobacco are being raised is because these are the most accessible substances. As I said, in the framework of really looking at the individual, it's not the drug or the substance that's the issue. It's more stability of the substance that's the issue in terms of, and these are things that can help at least the age of engagement with these substances, because as discussed by Diana and with early exposure to these substances in a developing brain can really have a negative effect in the way the brain is developing. So if at worst we want to delay the initiation age of these substances, at best we want it not really. So media can become effective, but media is something that needs to be contextualized in what we're talking about media. We're not talking about as in the same context. We're not talking about discussing drugs or awareness raising or fear raising. Really kind of, it would embrace the life skills and social skills or the parenting skills programs that we are putting in nationally, but they have to be targeted for which audience, resolute non-users versus like people that are contemplating use versus people that are already using a really divert treatment, or and the age groups that we're dealing with. And it's important to contextualize that science-based media is what we're talking about. And workplace prevention becomes important as well here in terms of what sort of policies that now the context is different. That we're talking about social context of work, not the school, where the social policies and the drug policies that are in work becomes important. What can be considered is designed there. I don't know how time is moving in my advantage. I'm not going to go into details, but the context of what we're talking about becomes evident in terms of what we're talking about. Health-based substance use packages within the work needs to be put in place, but at the same time, drug policies in terms of needs to be embraced within the workplace as well. Prevention and entertainment venue as well becomes important. Training staff, managers, and responsibles on beverage services, on the management of intoxication in the as well as on the patrons, how to kind of engage with the law enforcement in these with the enforcement of policies. communication to raise awareness inside these entertainment venues could be also considered. Treatment packages for staff and managers that are exposed a lot to different sort of pressures inside can be considered, and brief intervention packages, particularly now we're talking at an age where initiation has occurred, what can be done at an early stage of intervention to provide the problem relating from an initiation of substance use or an early stage of substance use to substance order. These are counseling sessions that can be provided in different venues, including in schools, for example, and beyond, to identify whether there's the problem is and how kind of basic counseling can be done before any referral, if necessary, for treatment is being done. So, in conclusion, what we're doing through the prevention standards is to focus on changing the culture of prevention taking place to be more aligned with what Wilson and Diana have presented in terms of science of prevention. We're very proud to see, for example, when we introduced our parenting and family skills work in the favelas of Panama City. These are underprivileged societies where the level of violence, youth violence, particularly youth gang violence in the context of Panama is high. We introduced these parenting skills and the prevention standards from preventing drug use. In one of the prevention science articles produced, one of the initiatives that was raised in Panama was an initiative of how the family skills introduced have changed the way the violence prevention is being addressed on a national level. So you see that shifting of paradigm, how it affects multiple strategies on a community level within the country. And this sort of work has also been disseminated on larger scales, also on the level of, you will see it in this article that I'm happy to share with whoever they want, and I'm sure we can mediate, how at the policy making level, including raising resolutions within the Commission on Drugs, which is our parliament and UNODC, the way things are being articulated in terms of what prevention strategies need to be put in place. What do we mean by evidence-based? Now anchoring them to the prevention standard is becoming something more effective for us in terms of moving forward. And we really appreciate at this note the efforts, for example, done by Slovenia in terms of moving forward a kind of specific resolution through the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, working on the value of social emotional learning and how it can support early childhood development at a later stage. So with that, I end on the message of the World Drug Day on the value of sharing facts on drugs and saving lives, and hopefully with your support, we can save lives, promoting the scientific evidence of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wadih. It was very valuable to stay until the end of this webinar with you, and I'm happy to see that most of attendees are still with us. So it was obviously very interesting to listen to you. Yeah, there is one question for some time already in Q&A, and it's very interesting and very common also in our from our experience. Is it true that personal experience presentations from recovered addicts as part of school curriculums have a counterproductive effect and actually can trigger adolescence? And should the educational systems abolish such practices? I know the answer, but I will leave it to you to explain.
Let's talk about the theoretical model of it. Yes, it is iatrogenic. In terms of this, we have it is iatrogenic. But let's logic of it. It's not that recovered drug users do not have a role in the spectrum of responses that I showcased between prevention and treatment. Recovered drug users can play a very effective role in outreach component when they're dealing with actual substance users and gearing them towards drug treatment. But I'm thinking about the thinking cap in terms of, I'm talking about a developing child, developing brain, and we're capitalizing on a recovered drug user from addressing a message on a universal basis. You have 100 in front of you, that are receiving this message. might be positively affected by this in the sense of they will not use it. But there is always that maybe 1, 2 children in that room that might be going through the same circumstances that recovered drug users is explaining in terms of the difficulties, the challenges, and why he used drugs to escape from these difficulties, and how he went through the journey of a difficult time, but went back and came back to give back to the community from that. That message at this age could be misunderstood in specific. These two, children that are random in the university being approached, where that substance to escape from the reality that it's going through might be a better pill to swallow than actually going through it. And there might be other alternative methods in terms of supporting these two children than this. And it might be that exposure that might have triggered something that the kids have not exposed to. And that's the thinking gap that the policymakers don't have. It's not like yes or no, this was bad. It is what did for what child at what age of development that determines what package.
Yeah, I think it would be also interesting to hear, Diana, what do you have to add to this from your point of view?
Yeah, I completely agree with what he it's similar to the scared straight model that many of you may be familiar with, where you bring young people into a prison and have prisoners talk to them about how scary it is and all the horrible things that happen in prison, and it's supposed to deter them. And here you have the same sort of situation where you have people who've been through, who are recovered, but are telling their personal experiences that you never know. Adolescents can misinterpret. They can take it out of context. It can even be glorified in some ways. So I've seen, in scared straight models in general, that children, particularly those that are at risk, feel that they're invulnerable, that it won't affect them, that they can do it in ways maybe others can't, and they won't become addicted, or they won't have to go through all of this because they are stronger than others. Like adolescents just don't process information sometimes in the same way the rest of us do, and can feel that it's a challenge in a way. But I think the evidence is clear that these sorts of lived experiences, well, it's good to understand all lived experiences and the perspectives of others. Don't think that, I know that the research shows that embedding these sorts of things into a curriculum have had iatrogenic effects, as Wadih has pointed out. So I agree with everything that he said. And I think it should be abolished. There's a lot of things, there are a lot of practices that schools can pick up that have no evidence base to them, but they might seem logical. They might even be very well intentioned, but some have not been studied. Others have been evaluated and found to, create more harm than good.
Yeah, we have cases when school or no school, parents ask schools to invite ex-drug users to preach to their children. So that's right. Something which is interesting, but school should be resistant to this and say, no,
right.
wait,
well,
this is not going.
Right, you and Wilson pointed out also early on that education, and so this is, thought to be part of an education. And just educating people isn't enough. It doesn't get at any of the underlying mechanisms that lead people down that pathway.
Yeah, and this question actually came from the policymaker, which is great.
It is.
And those policymakers are usually a very tough target group for us, evidence-based prevention advocates. Yeah. So, Wadih, what would you recommend from your experience in different countries? What could be a positive trigger for policy and decision makers to change the mindset and invest in standards, implementation of standards and evidence-based prevention?
Well, the way we're doing it, Matej, is operating on a top-down approach.
Yes.
We work with policymakers. We open that prevention standards to understand the value that science exists and why it's important, and why it's important to invest in it, and why not investing is wrong, and why investing in it will help you link with other ministries and bring back a strategy and link to social development, the sustainable development, and everything like this. It remains a theoretical model that they would buy or not buy into, but it at least will open the door for service providers at the bottom level, at least to get to work with evidence-based programs. At the same time, we warm up. So we try to engage, and particularly we work with low and middle income countries where there's no situation. And in other countries, we encourage people to, for example, that have, and the social, as a CSO, the capacity to work with evidence-based programs to actually implement these programs at the prevention level and document its effectiveness nationally to show the transferability of this. And it's not science that is in the US no, this is science that's based on the development of a child, and a child, regardless of race, ethnicity, or gender, right, is a child, and has their own characteristic, and it's a human being, right? So that science, the transferability and documenting its effectiveness in different countries and publishing in one way or another the effectiveness of this would also echo the message bottom up for the policymaker to understand that this is not science fiction. This is real that can actually be in your country, and it's worth investing in. So this sort of approach for us has been key in terms of success to change the culture of prevention.
Great, thank you. Great answer. Maybe we can use some of your advice in Slovenia as well, for sure. And
I could just add to that really quickly is that, just maybe to mirror and emphasize what he has said is that providing success stories and actually both monetizing them and making, translating the successes into numbers, into percentages. So if you put this program in place, you're going to save how much per case, right? Or to what extent did risk behaviors of certain sorts, academic failure, substance use, etc., what percentage did it drop? Really putting it into numbers and then providing the cost estimates of the benefits of using preventative rather than reactive strategies are what really can be convincing to policymakers. They need to know it's feasible. They need to know it's scalable. They need to know that uptake is going to benefit in ways that, that are cost effective and also reduce human burden.
Yeah, but in too many cases, they want results too early.
Right, exactly, right. You have to get some proximal outcomes so that within their 2-year term or whatever it is, you have some, some metric that you've used that you can say such and such has been reduced and this is a major risk factor for, so that you can keep them motivated to continue on. So just little benchmarks or big benchmarks all along the way. Yeah,
ongoing advocacy as a lifestyle of prevention professionals.
Right.
That's our life.
Right.
In reality, there is another. I think this will be the last question we will mention and answer. It's about poor self-regulation. Poor self-regulation is inherent characteristic of adolescence because of immature prefrontal cortex, and to some extent we can improve that, but the developmental susceptibility to risk behavior probably remains. So we are somehow limited in our efforts.
So
very interesting.
That is a lovely question. I love that. And it's so, people are concerned because risky behavior characterizes adolescence. And as I had indicated in my presentation, it's because the prefrontal cortex isn't completely connected. It's well developed, but it's not completely connected. It has more development to undergo, and that's normal. But there are risk factors in the prevailing environment, in the home and the community and so forth, and individual propensities that can further delay the process of self-regulation. And so that might be normative, and they might experiment. And we know that experimentation is normative. What is not normative is escalation. What's not normative is entrenchment of substance use behaviors. And that's what we need to pay attention to. And the way we can do that is to reinforce that, I don't know that we can accelerate development beyond what is normative, but we can normalize trajectories in those that have been exposed to a lot of trauma and a lot of adversity and a lot of other sorts of risk factors to protect them. Adolescence is a period where we need to protect them. Harm reduction strategies are important during adolescence so that when they do engage, they don't harm themselves or others. But it's also minor. Usually normatively, risky behaviors are not dangerous, right? I'm gonna try a cigarette. I'm gonna, various other things that I probably don't want to mention. But, and just some experimentation is completely normal. But if it goes beyond that and it's illegal behavior, it's extreme, it's harmful, then, self-regulation can be reinforced through interventions that specifically target the top-down control, the strengthening of the prefrontal cortex. And that involves, more, intensive intervention that has program components that focus on problem solving, conflict resolution, goal direction, impulse control. You could go on and on. Some of my slides listed them and I didn't go through them in detail, but there are interventions that strengthen these things. In essence, what you're doing is normalizing trajectories so that they can get through adolescence successfully and into adulthood.
So take-home message is that we adults are responsible for adolescence.
Yeah, well.
Parents, teachers, policymakers, all of us.
Yes, we need to create these environments that will ensure successful development.
Great.
And with the message that some parents and some caregivers would need more than others. Because Diana mentioned it's like the brain of adolescents in general, but in our situation, engage with parents that are raising their children in conflict settings or displacement or refugees or other stressful services. These sort of, so that we don't put the blame, sometimes these social structures around the children are operating in very challenging environment and requires the extra boost of our support.
Great. So any final thoughts from you before we conclude this meeting?
Thank you for the invite and for the patience of the participant that stayed that long. Nothing more to add, but I leave the last word for Diana.
No, I just thank all of you for your interest in this area, and we're very happy to follow up afterwards if there are more questions or need for resources. Thank you all.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure.
I can say that we will use this recording for to promote this webinar and the topics which we think are extremely important for prevention professionals in different fields and different settings. So thank you very much. It was an honor to host you, some of you again, and hopefully we will make some other webinars together in the future or meet in person and organize some nice working meetings. And it's nice to see that Wilson is again with us. So any final thoughts from you?
Well, I listened to part of the discussion. I really appreciate the focus on enhancing our evidence base to make sure that the prevention interventions that are implemented across the globe actually have the impact that we're all hoping for. We all share a vision for minimizing the impacts of substances and improving the health of our communities. And I think we've provided some good information to point you in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. So we're just on time with conclusions. Thank you, and hope to meet you soon again in person at some conferences in US or in Europe, wherever. And thank you very much again for your contribution to this webinar and to our coalition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matej.
Thanks.
And goodbye, and thanks to all attendees for joining us today. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, Matej.